The forest was blanketed in snow, each tree standing still under a thick, white coat. It was a bitterly cold night, the kind where each breath came out as a cloud of frost in the moonlight. The sky above was clear, filled with stars, but there was no comfort in their light. Everything was silent, save for the occasional creak of tree branches weighed down by ice. The ground crunched beneath Jack's heavy boots as he made his way along the narrow path, his lantern casting a dim, wavering glow around him. Jack pulled his coat tighter against the wind that sliced through the forest like a knife. He'd lived in these woods long enough to know that a night like this could turn deadly for any living thing caught without shelter. He muttered to himself, his voice breaking the stillness around him. "Should have stayed by the fire," he grumbled, clutching his lantern. "Nothing but cold and trouble out here." As he moved deeper into the forest, a faint sound caught his ear, something out of place. He paused, strained to hear over the howling wind. There it was again, a soft whimper that sent a chill down his spine. "What in the world?" Jack muttered, turning his lantern toward the source of the sound. Following the faint cries, he stumbled upon a small, snow-covered basket nestled at the base of an old pine tree. The cries grew louder, now unmistakably those of an infant. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he knelt beside the basket, lifting the edge of a thin blanket to reveal a baby, red-faced and squirming in the cold. Who would leave a baby out here?" Jack exclaimed, glancing around the dark forest as if expecting an answer. The baby let out a wail, louder this time, and Jack's rough demeanor softened. He carefully scooped the child into his arms, feeling the fragile warmth of its body against the biting wind. "All right, little one," he said softly, trying to calm both the child and himself. "Let's get you somewhere warm." As he cradled the baby, he glanced over his shoulder, almost expecting someone to emerge from the darkness. But there was no one, only the quiet, eerie calm of the forest. Jack shook his head and turned back toward the path. "I don't know who you belong to," he muttered under his breath, "but you're not staying out here tonight." With that, Jack began the trek back to his cabin, the baby nestled securely in his arms, the forest watching in silence as the snow continued to fall. Jack was a rugged man in his late 30s, with a weathered face framed by a scruffy beard. He lived alone in a small, sturdy cabin tucked away deep in the forest. As the gamekeeper, his job was to keep the woods safe from poachers and watch over the land. Most days, he welcomed the solitude. The woods were his sanctuary, a place where he could be left alone with his thoughts. This night, however, something was different. As he held the baby in his arms, Jack felt a surge of emotions he hadn't experienced in years: fear, concern, and an odd sense of responsibility. He glanced down at the infant, who was now staring up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Easy there, little one," Jack muttered, trying to sound calm. "We're almost home." He shifted the baby in his arms, adjusting the blanket to shield its tiny face from the biting wind. It was clear this child was no more than a few months old. The baby was dressed in nothing but a thin onesie, utterly unsuited for the harsh cold. Jack couldn't understand who would leave a child like this out here in the middle of nowhere. As he continued trudging through the snow, his mind raced. He wasn't exactly equipped to care for a baby. His cabin was sparse, with only the essentials: a bed, a wood stove, and a few pots and pans. But what choice did he have? He couldn't just leave the child to fend for itself in the freezing night. "Great," he sighed, glancing down at the baby. "Looks like you've got yourself a new housemate, Jack. What do you think about that?" The baby responded with a soft coo, eyes still locked onto him as if sensing his uncertainty. Jack managed a faint smile. "Yeah, well, don't get too comfortable," he mumbled, trying to keep his tone gruff. "We're just gonna figure this out until we find who you belong to." A few minutes later, he pushed open the door to his cabin, the warmth from the hearth spilling out into the frigid air. Carefully, he carried the baby inside and closed the door behind him. The room was dimly lit by the glowing embers in the fireplace. Jack approached the small bed by the fire, gently laying the baby down. "There you go, nice and warm," he said softly, pulling the blanket up around the baby's shoulders. As Jack turned to stoke the fire, he muttered to himself, "What do I know about taking care of a baby, huh?" The baby let out a tiny plaintive cry, and Jack quickly turned back, his eyes wide. All right, don't start that again," he pleaded, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Look, I'm figuring this out as I go, okay?" He looked around the cabin, searching for anything that might help. Spotting an old woolen blanket, he folded it up and placed it next to the baby as an improvised bed cushion. "There, that's better, right?" Jack asked, glancing down at the baby, who had quieted and was now staring at him intently. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Jack sank down into the chair beside the bed, rubbing his hands over his face. "What in the world am I supposed to do now?" he muttered, staring into the fire. The baby let out a soft gurgle, almost as if in response, and Jack couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, I guess we'll figure this out together," he sighed, a hint of a smile breaking through his rugged demeanor. "You got a name, kid?" "No." "All right, how about we work on that too?" In that moment, surrounded by the crackling warmth of the fire and the soft breathing of the baby, Jack felt a strange but profound shift in his heart. His life, once so solitary and predictable, had suddenly been turned upside down by this tiny, helpless bundle. And though he had no idea what the next steps would be, he knew he couldn't turn his back on the child now. The baby was tiny, no more than a few months old, wrapped in a threadbare blanket that did little to keep out the bitter cold. Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of worry as he looked at the infant. The child's cheeks were flushed red, not from warmth, but from the biting chill. It was a miracle that the baby was still conscious, crying out for help with a voice that was already beginning to weaken from the cold air. Kneeling beside the basket, Jack ran a calloused hand gently over the baby's head, his heart pounding. The infant's eyes, watery and wide, locked onto his face, and for a moment, he felt as though he was staring into the depths of something profound. "Hey there, little one," Jack murmured, his voice unusually soft. "Where'd you come from, huh?" The baby didn't answer, of course, only let out a pitiful whimper that tightened the knot in Jack's chest. The gamekeeper knew he had to act fast. In these conditions, a baby wouldn't survive much longer. He scooped the child up, cradling it awkwardly against his chest, trying to shield its small body from the freezing wind. "All right, I've got you," he muttered, glancing around the forest as if expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows. "But we need to get you warm, fast." As he hurried back to his cabin, the baby nestled close to his chest. Jack could feel the shivering of the tiny body. He walked faster, his breath coming out in sharp, icy bursts as he pushed his way through the thickening snow. Inside the cabin, Jack quickly moved toward the fireplace. He threw a couple of logs onto the dying embers, coaxing the flames to life. The warmth began to spread through the room, and he could feel the child start to relax in his arms, its cries becoming softer, more sporadic. "There you go," he said, setting the baby down on his small bed and wrapping it tightly in one of his woolen blankets. "We're gonna get you warmed up." The baby blinked up at him, still whimpering softly. Jack took a deep breath, looking around his sparse cabin for anything that might help. He spotted an old kettle on the stove and hurried to fill it with water. As he set the kettle over the fire, he mumbled to himself, "You're gonna need something warm to drink. What do babies drink anyway? Milk, right?" The baby responded with a small hiccup, its face scrunching up as if to say, "Of course, you fool." Jack let out a shaky laugh despite the situation. "Yeah, I know not much of a nanny here," he said, turning to the baby with a smirk. "But we'll make do, okay? Somehow." He found an old tin cup and filled it with warm water from the kettle, then soaked a piece of clean cloth in it. It wasn't much, but it was the best he could manage for now. He brought the cup over to the bed and gently pressed the damp cloth against the baby's lips. The infant immediately latched onto it, sucking on the warm moisture as if it were life itself. "Easy, easy," Jack whispered, steadying the cloth with his hand. "There you go. It's not much, but it'll help." The baby calmed down a bit, eyes closing as it continued to suck on the cloth. Jack watched with a mixture of relief and helplessness, his heart still racing. This wasn't like anything he'd ever dealt with before. Wild animals, poachers, harsh weather, those he could handle. But a helpless baby? "Well, you're a tough little one, aren't you?" he said quietly, pulling up a chair to sit beside the bed. "You're gonna need to be if you're sticking around here." The baby gave a small sigh, its tiny chest rising and falling rhythmically as it began to drift into sleep. Jack leaned back, staring into the fire, his mind swirling with questions. Who would leave a baby out there in the middle of the forest? And why? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden soft cooing sound from the baby. It stirred slightly, a small fist reaching out from the blanket, as if searching for something or someone. Jack watched, his heart unexpectedly tightening. All right, he muttered, reaching out his hand. The baby's tiny fingers curled around his thumb, holding on with surprising strength. "Guess you're stuck with me for now," Jack said softly, his gaze fixed on the small hand wrapped around his. "And I promise I'll do my best, even if I'm not sure what I'm doing." The room was warm now, the fire crackling gently, and for a moment, everything felt strangely peaceful. Jack sat there, keeping his thumb within the baby's grasp, watching as the child finally slipped into a deep, steady sleep. Jack stared at the baby, now sound asleep, wrapped snugly in the woolen blanket on his bed. The cabin was small, built for a man living alone, not for caring for an infant. The fireplace was the only source of heat, and while it kept the room warm enough for one person, Jack wasn't sure it was sufficient for the delicate life now in his care. He paced back and forth in front of the bed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. His mind raced with questions, doubts, and fears. He was a gamekeeper, a man who spent most of his days in the forest, patrolling for poachers and tracking wildlife. What did he know about raising a child? And who on earth would leave a baby in the middle of nowhere? "All right, Jack," he muttered to himself, hands on his hips as he stopped to stare at the sleeping infant. "Think this through. You find the kid, you bring him in from the cold. Now what?" The baby stirred, letting out a soft sigh, and Jack felt his resolve harden slightly. He couldn't just walk away from this responsibility. Whoever had abandoned this child clearly wasn't coming back, and he couldn't leave the little one to fend for itself. With a heavy sigh, Jack dragged a chair over and sat down beside the bed. "Okay, kid," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. "Looks like you're sticking around for a while." He rubbed the back of his neck, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "But let's get one thing straight," he continued, trying to sound stern. "I'm no father, you hear me? I don't know the first thing about babies." The baby, of course, didn't answer, but a small hand slipped free of the blanket, fingers curling and uncurling as if reaching out. Jack sighed again and extended his hand, letting the infant's tiny fingers wrap around his thumb. A surprising warmth spread through his chest at the gesture, and he shook his head. "Well, you're not giving me much of a choice, are you?" he muttered, his voice softening. "Guess we're in this together now." He sat there for a moment longer, watching the baby sleep, his mind already running through what he would need to do. First things first, he would have to find some proper supplies. Food, blankets, maybe even a crib if he could find one. And then there was the matter of figuring out who this child was and how they ended up in the forest. The baby shifted, making a small noise, and Jack's heart clenched. "All right," he said, standing up. "Time to get to work." He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and threw it over his shoulders. Before heading out, he glanced back at the baby, now nestled peacefully among the blankets. "I'll be right back," he promised, though he doubted the baby could understand him. "Just gonna find something to keep you fed." As he opened the door, a gust of cold air rushed in, making the baby squirm slightly. Jack quickly closed the door behind him, grumbling to himself as he began his trek to the village. "Of all the things I thought I'd be dealing with today," he muttered, trudging through the snow. Finding a baby wasn't on the list. A short while later, Jack reached the small general store in the village. He pushed open the door, the bell overhead jingling. Mrs. Higgins, the store's owner, looked up from behind the counter, her eyes widening at the sight of Jack. "Well, if it isn't Jack Fletcher," she exclaimed, putting down the ledger she was reading. "What brings you into town this late and looking like you've seen a ghost?" Jack rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a bit awkward. "I need some baby supplies, Mrs. Higgins," he said, his tone gruff. The elderly woman blinked at him, clearly taken aback. Baby supplies. Since when do you have a baby? Jack sighed, leaning on the counter. I found one. Out in the forest. Someone left a baby in a basket and, well, I brought it to my cabin. Mrs. Higgins gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Left a baby? In this weather? That's terrible. Well, bless you, Jack, for taking the poor thing in. Yeah, Jack muttered, feeling a bit embarrassed by her praise. Just tell me what I need to take care of it. Mrs. Higgins gave him a long, scrutinizing look before nodding. All right, you'll need formula, bottles, blankets, and some diapers, for sure. I'll get you everything. As she bustled around gathering supplies, Jack leaned against the counter, letting out a long breath. This wasn't what he planned, but he knew in his gut he was doing the right thing. After a few minutes, Mrs. Higgins returned with a basket full of items. There you go, she said, smiling warmly. If you need any help, just let me know. And Jack, you're doing a good thing, looking after that little one. Jack nodded, picking up the basket. Thanks, Mrs. Higgins, he said gruffly, turning to leave. I'm just trying to figure this out as I go. As he walked back to the cabin, the weight of the supplies in his arms felt like a small comfort. He had a plan now, albeit a rough one. He would take care of this child, at least until he could figure out where it belonged. When he finally made it back to the cabin, he set the basket of supplies down and approached the bed. The baby was still sleeping soundly, its tiny fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. Jack watched for a moment, then pulled up a chair and sat down beside it again. All right, kid, he said quietly, his voice steady. I guess you're with me for now. So let's get through this together, one step at a time. The baby stirred, letting out a small sigh, and Jack felt an unexpected warmth fill his chest. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel quite so alone. As Jack settled into the rhythm of his new reality, the nights grew colder and snow continued to fall outside his small cabin. It had been a few days since he found the baby, and the child was now starting to show signs of strength. Jack had grown used to the cries for food, the coos, and even the midnight awakenings. Yet, despite the new routine, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation was out of the ordinary. It was late evening, and the cabin was warmly lit by the glow of the fireplace. Jack had just finished feeding the baby with one of the bottles he had picked up from Mrs. Higgins' store. The little one was calm now, nestled in his arms, eyes fluttering closed in contentment. Jack sighed, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. All right, kiddo, he murmured, gently rocking the baby. Looks like you're finally getting the hang of this, huh? The baby gave a small, sleepy yawn, and Jack smiled to himself. He stood up carefully, holding the child against his chest as he walked toward the window. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, blanketing the forest in a serene silence. As he looked out, he couldn't help but wonder about the baby's origins. Who had left this child out in the woods? And why? The questions tugged at his mind, refusing to be ignored. Suddenly, breaking through the quiet of the night, Jack heard a faint sound. He froze, straining his ears to catch it. It was soft, melodic, like a lullaby carried on the wind. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, and it seemed to seep into the cabin, wrapping around him and the baby in a cocoon of calm. What the? Jack muttered, his eyes narrowing as he peered out into the darkened woods. There was no one in sight. The snow fell silently, undisturbed. The lullaby continued, growing clearer yet remaining ethereal, as though it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Jack felt a chill run down his spine, not from the cold, but from the sense that something supernatural was at play. He looked down at the baby, now fully awake and staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. The child's tiny hands grasped at the air as if trying to reach for the invisible source of the melody. "Do you hear that?" Jack whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He felt foolish for asking, but there was an eerie familiarity to the song that unnerved him. The baby cooed softly in response, its eyes never leaving his face. "All right," Jack muttered, steeling himself. "Let's see what's going on." He carefully placed the baby back on the bed, tucking the blanket securely around it. The lullaby still drifted through the cabin, as if it were a part of the air itself. Jack grabbed his coat and lantern, determined to find the source of the sound. Before he stepped outside, he glanced back at the baby. "Stay put," he said, his voice firm but filled with concern. "I'll be right back." As he stepped out into the night, the cold air hit him like a wall, making him catch his breath. He scanned the dark forest, the glow from his lantern barely cutting through the swirling snow. The lullaby grew softer as he moved away from the cabin, as if trying to lure him deeper into the woods. Jack's heart pounded as he walked, the melody pulling at something deep within him. It was both comforting and unsettling, like a memory just out of reach. He continued forward, following the sound, but no matter how far he walked, he couldn't find its source. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing through the trees. "Who's there?" Silence answered him. The lullaby faded into the wind, leaving only the sound of the snow crunching under his boots. Jack stood still, his breath coming in visible puffs of white mist, his senses on high alert. After several minutes, he sighed, turning back toward the cabin. "Figures," he muttered to himself. "Probably just the wind playing tricks on me." But as he approached the cabin, the lullaby returned, clear and distinct, as though it were coming from inside. He rushed to the door, throwing it open. Inside, the baby was wide awake, staring at the ceiling with a look of wonder on its face. The room was filled with the melody, a gentle, soothing hum that filled every corner. Jack's eyes widened, and he felt his legs go weak. "What is happening?" he breathed, closing the door behind him. The baby turned its gaze to him, tiny hands stretching out, and for a moment, Jack could have sworn he saw a glimmer of understanding in those innocent eyes. The lullaby continued, its origin still a mystery, and yet, it seemed to be directed at the baby, as if it was meant solely for this child. Jack slowly walked over to the bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He crouched down, staring at the baby, his face a mixture of confusion and awe. "Who are you?" he whispered, more to himself than to the infant. "And who left you here, with this song?" The baby merely cooed again, reaching up towards him. Jack let out a shaky breath, his mind racing. He had no answers, only more questions, but one thing was clear. This child was no ordinary baby, and whatever was happening was beyond his understanding. "Well," he said, attempting to regain his composure, "it looks like you've brought a bit of mystery with you, haven't you?" The lullaby began to fade, leaving behind a heavy silence that settled over the cabin. Jack could feel the atmosphere shift, the air almost buzzing with an unspoken promise, or perhaps a warning. "All right then," he muttered, picking up the baby and holding it close. "I don't know what's going on here, but we'll figure it out, together." As he rocked the baby gently in his arms, the child let out a contented sigh, eyes closing in peaceful sleep. Jack glanced around the cabin, his eyes lingering on the shadows that danced on the walls. Something had changed, and though he didn't know what lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting this child out of his sight, not until he understood the truth behind the mysterious lullaby.